Hello, friends! What's up? It's me, Emily, and I'm back in my normal spot. I am going to be back at my parents' house for the next couple weeks. I am very bad at planning when I need to be places. So if you're new here, hi, welcome to my channel. My name's Emily. I'm DIY My Way over on Instagram. If you don't follow me, you should totally check it out, but after the video. And I love to make things. So every week I sit down and I work on a project that I've been whipping on, which means work in progress, or working on in maker speak if you're not familiar. And I tell you a true crime story. So before we jump in, I do want to call out what I'm wearing today. This is one of my favorite crochet garments. This is the Diamondback Tee by Kara from KP Crochet Designs. She's wonderful. If you're a crocheter and you haven't made one of her patterns, honestly, what are you doing? And then what I'm making today is this guy. I'll try to show you the whole thing. So this is the Flurries in the Wind Wrap. It's from 2&Me's Mindfulness Knitting Collection. It's a suite of patterns. So there were actually, I believe, 6 patterns in this suite that I bought for $12. And this is the first one that I picked up. But one of my goals actually is to teach myself new techniques. So this has holes in it on purpose. That being said, it's probably going to be a teeny bit choppy because I cannot make these little eyelet things and talk at the same time. I have tried. So if I pause and put a row in of eyelets and then talk to you again, that's what's going on. Okay, so this week we're just going to jump right into the story with no context except for this warning. This week's episode involves the murder of children as well as sexual assault and rape. I don't go into it in great detail, but this is heavy. Viewer discretion is advised. I will not be offended if you click off right now. Do what you got to do for you guys. It's okay. It was June 13th, 1977, and Lori Farmer was so excited. She was getting ready to head off to Girl Scout camp for the first time, which I personally connected to a lot because I went to Girl Scout camp as a kid, and it was seriously the best week. She was 8 years old. It was her first time getting to go to sleepaway camp. She had begged and begged and begged her mother, and her mother would describe Lori as a really mature for her age kind of girl. She was ready to take things on. She was the youngest one at camp and definitely didn't feel like it or act like it. She was just so excited and ready for the world. Her tent mate, Denise Milner, was not quite as excited. Lori and Denise didn't know each other before going to camp, but Denise actually had surprised her mother when she asked to go at all. At 9 years old, her mother described her as a homebody. Denise actually had begged to go to this camp, but a couple days before camp, she kind of flipped. She was like, actually, please don't make me go. I'd rather just stay home. This, really, I don't want to do this. But her mother was like, we paid for this. You're going. And this back and forth actually went on until the day that the girls were departing. And at the bus pickup to take the 140 girls out to Camp Scott, Denise's mother made a deal with her. You stay one night, and if you hate it, I'll come pick you up. So they made the deal, and Denise was talking to one of the counselors and gets on the bus. The third girl that was in their tent was Michele Goose. Michele Goose. She actually was coming back for her second year of camp. She was also super excited, and her father made a comment to the media afterwards that it felt like she knew something would go wrong when she was saying goodbye. He said, quote, "It was like a premonition. She hugged us goodbye, and it was like she was saying goodbye and that she was never going to see us again." Now, given what happened, I could totally see him looking back in hindsight on that, but I don't know if he necessarily believed that at the time. Would you put your kids on a bus if you believed that? All of the campers met at a central spot near Tulsa, Oklahoma, and were bussed out to Camp Scott. Camp Scott was located on Native American land, and it still is. It's closed and abandoned today, but it's still on that land. But so the way that Girl Scout camp is set up, if you've never been, is, or at least in my experience, and this camp was set up the same way, there are several campsites, and different groups that kind of like do activities together are at different campsites. So the campsites or units all have names, and they kind of call the group of girls by their campsite's name during the week. So our 3 girls in this story were at Kiowa. That was their campsite's name. In Kiowa, there were 8 total tents. Each tent could house 4 girls. And the 8 tents, one of them was a counselor tent, and then tents 2 through 7 were camper tents. So like I said, Lori, Denise, and Michele were in tent 8. Tent 8 was definitely the furthest away from the counselor tent. It was also the only tent that couldn't be seen directly from the counselor tent. There was a kind of kitchen building between there, like the kitchen area, or it was kind of a covered picnic table area, or at least that's what it was when I went to camp. I never went to this camp, to be clear, but that's kind of what that space would be. They were also the closest tent to the latrines, which, if you have never used a latrine, count your blessings and don't use one. It is not something you do for the experience. Latrines are kind of bathrooms, but also kind of holes in the ground. Basically, they build a bathroom around a hole in the ground that is where everyone uses the bathroom. It's lovely. It smells great. Yeah, but so they were in the tent closest to the latrines. That meant that all of the other girls would walk past their tent to go to the bathroom and get ready for bed. So these 3 girls, they didn't actually know each other at the start of camp, and that's not totally abnormal for Girl Scout camp. The way it works, sometimes troops will go together, or sometimes girls will just choose to go. And when troops go together, they'll be placed in a tent together. Otherwise, the girls that don't come with a troop are placed together, and they kind of get to know each other. So the counselors actually said that these 3 girls, they were quiet on their own, but they became really fast friends. The counselors actually would say, you couldn't tell the difference in the noise coming from the tents of the girls who knew each other before and the girls who didn't. They really bonded quickly. And they actually, for a while in the day and into the evening, had a 4th friend, a girl named Angela Sweet. Angela was 10, and she was there with her troop, but there were 5 of them. And so, they went to the tent, and the camp director came and said, there's not room, so Angela, you were the last one out of this group to sign up. We're going to go ahead and move you to this other tent. And so Angela, she brought her stuff over to tent 8. She got settled in, and she got to know the girls. But a few hours later, the camp director would come back and say, we were able to shuffle things around. This tent's big enough that we can put a 5th bed in there, and you're going to go ahead and move back. So Angela left the girls, and there were only 3 girls in tent 8 when the evening started. The reason that I say when the evening started is because there was an early evening thunderstorm that night that kind of canceled their campfire or whatever activities they would have been doing. And instead, the girls were in their tents, and they all wrote letters home, which is something that you do at camp. Writing pen pals at camp is a very normal thing, or at least in my experience it was. What they didn't know was that these letters would be the last words that the girls would leave for their families, because the next morning, all 3 girls in tent 8 would be found murdered. So it was the first night of Girl Scout camp, which is kind of a giant sleepover. The tents of girls would stay up, they would be talking and giggling and telling stories and shining their flashlights. There would be lots of horseplay with the girls, as they got ready for bed and shining flashlights at each other. Or sneaking up on each other's tents and, I'm going to shine a flashlight at your tent, like that type of stuff. So the counselors would say that activity did go on, and the girls would describe that as well. Some girls actually described a group of 3 flashlights that looked like it was kind of up in the woods, in the woods behind the latrines, so closest to tent 8. And they said, they saw those 3 flashlights up there, they shined their lights up and called out, the lights would turn off and never come back on. And they didn't hear anything around it. But they just kind of thought it was a group of girls playing a prank and didn't think much of it. Later in the night, one of the counselors at another unit saw kind of a dim light out in the woods. And she thought at first that a camper was out in the woods and was like, what's going on? You shouldn't be out there. So she stops and she shines her flashlight up at it. When she does, the light immediately turns off. She's like, well, that's fishy. So she turns her light off and she waits. Several minutes later, she would say that this light came back on. And after another few minutes, it started to move northwest, which would be in the direction of the Kiowa campsite at this point. So I don't know if she actually did anything from it. I wasn't able to find that in the news articles, but she did report that this happened. Even later in the night, around 1:30 in the morning, a counselor in the Kiowa unit woke up because she heard these horrible noises. And these noises would be reported by women across the campground. But this counselor said that these noises were undescribable. The best way that she could describe them, they didn't sound human per se, but they also weren't any animal that she was familiar with. They were almost moaning sounds, not quite in pain, and a little bit of a grating sound. But again, the best way that she could describe them when asked or when pressed was that they were undescribable. They were just these horrible noises. And then they just suddenly stopped. And she says that she investigated a little bit, but she didn't see anything, and thought, maybe, we're out in the woods. Maybe something happened. But she went back to bed. That same counselor actually woke up about 5.5 hours later. It was 6 a.m., and she had intentionally gotten up early so that she could hit the showers before the girls get up. Because who wants to shower with a bunch of stinky 8 to 10-year-old campers? So she gets up, she grabs her shower pack, and she's walking on the trail towards the camp showers. They would have a couple of shower units that multiple campsites would use, right? So she's walking towards there, and while she's walking on the trail, she sees something off to the side of the trail, and it looks like a sleeping bag. She would tell the media that her first thought actually was that, maybe the bus had brought more equipment up later at night, and it was after the storm started and they didn't see it. And her second thought was, which little girl was without a sleeping bag last night? She had done night checks and thought that she had seen everybody in a sleeping bag. So she's like, well, this is weird. She approaches it and starts to investigate, and inside of the sleeping bag, she finds the beaten body of a little girl. That little girl would later be identified as Lori. Once she realizes this, she looks around and sees 2 more bags further back. And those bags would be found to hold Denise and Michele. All 3 girls from tent 8 were dead in their sleeping bags between 100 and 150 yards away from their tent. So this counselor, she alerts the camp director. The camp director alerts the authorities, and by 7:30 in the morning, so an hour and a half after she gets up, the police are there. And the whole campsite is sprung into action at this point. So the camp director alerted the police, and by 7:30 in the morning, local authorities had arrived on the scene. They very quickly realized that this was a violent attack, and they had to get the campers out of there. So the counselors gathered up the campers, and around 10 a.m., they were evacuated from the campsite. One of the campers would later tell the media, they said that something was wrong with the water, and so we had to leave camp early. So really, the campers were told nothing about what was going on. And the parents weren't told much either. Most of the parents saw it on the news that there were 3 people dead at this camp, but they didn't really know who it was or what was going on. So the parents all showed up at the pickup spot because they had seen on the news, these girls are coming back, anxious to see if their daughters were alive. The girls were actually shocked to find their parents panicked when they got off the bus. Some of the parents were even crying. And they had to tell their daughters what had happened, but they didn't really have much information either. The camp did something that day that actually, it sat wrong with the parents of the victims, and they would later sue them for a variety of things, but this would be one of the things included on that lawsuit. When everything happened and they had figured out who the victims were and what was going on, the camp didn't call the parents first to notify them that their daughters had been killed. Instead, they made 2 phone calls. The first phone call was to the lawyers, like the camp's lawyers, and the second was to the camp's insurance company. So, kind of looks like they're covering up their own selves, which, it feels hypocritical because I totally understand that. They're liable, they're trying to figure out what they need to do, what they need to say, what they can't say. But at the same time, to the parents, It's not a good look. So this happens, and even when they talked to the parents, they didn't tell them a whole lot. All they said was that there had been an accident and that their daughters had died. But what happened to Lori, Denise, and Michele was absolutely not an accident. The 3 girls had been brutally raped and strangled to death. The camp would close its doors that day, and it would stay closed forever. So at this point, the investigation was actually able to begin. All of the children were gone. And they go into Tent 8 and find an absolutely bloody scene. There was blood all over the tent. What it looked like, or what investigators later pieced together, was that the perpetrator had come in through the back of the tent and struck the girls, most likely on the head while they were asleep in their beds. The girls were then beaten with a long instrument that they later determined or suspected to be a red flashlight that was found with the bodies. But the girls were beaten, and Michele and Lori were actually killed in the tent. Denise died later than both of them. And they know this because when the bodies were found, Lori and Michele's bodies were cold, and rigor mortis was beginning to set in, which indicated that they had been dead for several hours. Denise, on the other hand, was actually still warm when she was found. She was bound with nylon rope. Like I said, there was a red flashlight that was found with the bodies. Inside of the flashlight, there was a newspaper jammed into the battery casing, which is important later. They also found 2 unique shoe prints. One that was a bloody shoe print inside of the cabin, and then one that was outside of the front of the cabin. The one that's in blood was definitely connected to the crime. The one that was outside may not have been connected to the crime because counselors would do things like night checks to make sure all the girls were in bed. So it is possible that that second shoe print is a counselor, but it was never determined either way. It was also very clear that Tent 8 was not the only tent that had been entered that night. Some reports actually say that a girl sleeping in Tent 7 saw someone with a flashlight approach her tent, open the flap, look inside, and then walk away. She assumed it was a counselor. Now, I didn't see this in a lot of reports and not in a lot of major news sources, so I don't know how credible it is, but it's something that I read. The other way that they know that someone was in more tents was that they started to find glasses, like eyeglasses. A lot of glasses were not able to be found the next morning, apparently, and they found them kind of around the campsite in different tents than where the owner was sleeping, just around in the kitchen, just in odd places. I've seen a lot of speculation around these glasses, was the person looking for glasses that fit their prescription? It kind of looked like they were picking them up, carrying them around, then finding a new pair, setting them down, switching, right? But that seems weird that you would come to a crime scene without the right glasses. I've also seen speculation that maybe this person was just this was a weird fetishy thing. I kind of think it was a power play. You're gonna kill these girls, but let's freak out the rest of them by going into everyone's tents and making sure they know that you were there, right? It's so creepy. But at the same time, if you're trying to get in people's heads and it's a psychological play, that's one way to do it. I know I wouldn't sleep as soundly ever again if I knew that a murderer literally came into my tent, took something off of my nightstand, and left. I'm actually going to double check my door lock tonight, now that I've said that. Gross. Anyway, they never really explained this, but again, it's important. So, as the investigation began, the police first looked into a farmer that lived up the road from the camp. He did have nylon rope on his farm that was almost identical to the rope that was found binding Denise. However, he had claimed that this rope had been stolen about a week before, and he had reported it stolen. The police did arrest him and investigate him, and he was determined to be not a part of it. At this point, they went ahead and brought in search dogs to help search. They had them smell things from the crime scene just to try to see if they could track down the killer in the woods. But what ended up happening was about 3 days later, there were a couple of squirrel hunters out in the woods, and they found this cave. They said they identified it because there was a bag that looked like it was a bag of flour outside of the cave. But they contacted Highway Patrol instead of going in because they thought that someone could be hiding in this cave. And they did know about the investigation that was going on. Now, why you would go squirrel hunting in the woods near where there were 3 brutal murders, I do not know. But they found the cave, which was a really good thing for the investigation. Police didn't actually find a person in the cave, but what they did find was a suspect. And hear me out. So inside of the cave, they found several items. There were 2 photographs of a woman that were kind of crinkled up or looked like they'd been folded. There was masking tape with a piece of garbage bag stuck to it. There were 2 pieces of newspaper, like ripped pieces. And there was a pair of women's glasses. Those glasses would actually be identified by one of the counselors as hers. So there's that tie to the crime scene or to the camp, right? Like these glasses were stolen from the camp and they were found in this cave. The second tie to the camp is actually the newspaper. And it's tied very directly to the crime scene because this newspaper, the missing piece or another piece that had been ripped off of this same paper, was the newspaper that was found inside of the battery compartment of the red flashlight. So police know whoever was in this cave was at the crime scene and held the murder weapon. Yeah, it's pretty damning, right? So they start to look and they're trying to figure out who was in this cave. And they think the way that we're going to figure this out is by figuring out who the woman is in these pictures or like what these pictures are from. You know, that's the most like identifiable piece of evidence found in the cave. So they end up publishing an ad in the national newspapers with this photo, like, who is this woman? Can you tell us who it is? And they used the actual photos that they found, right? So the photos ended up being connected to a man named Lewis Lindsay. Lewis Lindsay worked at a prison in Oklahoma, and on the side, or like kind of his hobby, it seemed like, was photography. So he would do his photography, and there was a darkroom at the prison that he would use to develop his photos. And he would let inmates participate in this. You know, he taught them how to develop them. He would let them develop negatives as like their own photo, things like that. So the photo that was in question had actually been developed by an inmate who had kept the photos or had been allowed to keep the photos. This inmate's name was Gene Leroy Hart. So Gene was Native American. He was a Cherokee man that was born on this reservation about a mile away from Camp Scott. He was born in 1943, and he was raised by a single mother. His father wasn't ever really in the picture in his life. He went to school and he was a C student. He got by, but he was never somebody that teachers would call out as, you know, the smartest kid in the class. But he was really good at sports. He was actually something of like a hometown football hero in high school. And many people would say, you know, if he had gone on to college, he could have played on a scholarship and all of these things, but he didn't. Instead, after graduating high school, he was married, and soon after, the couple had 2 children. And Gene was, or would have been described as, a family man. He loved his wife, he loved his kids, but at some point, before 1966, something changed. His wife described his change in demeanor as he became bitter and depressed. And it was never said really what caused that. But that did happen. And in 1966, he confessed, was arrested, charged, and confessed to kidnapping, raping, and sodomizing, which is, raping, but in the booty. I feel so uncomfortable saying that. I don't know why, but I mean, I do know why, but so he confessed to this, to doing that to 2 pregnant women. After doing this, he took duct tape and wrapped it all the way around their whole faces, intending to suffocate them. One of the women was able to remove the duct tape enough that she could still breathe and survived. which is how he was convicted. So he was in prison and actually had escaped in 1973. So this is 4 years before the Girl Scouts were murdered at Camp Scott, but he was still at large when the murder happened. So he had been escaped from prison and on the run for 4 years at this point. So Gene was identified as a suspect because of the photo, but it's also speculated that he was identified or further pursued as a suspect because of those sounds that people heard. The victim that survived from his initial rape conviction, or rape, kidnapping, etc. conviction, testified that while he was raping her, he made these just indescribable, inhuman sounds, which we do know that 2 of the 3 victims were confirmed to have been raped, and Lori was not confirmed because she was so small that they were unable to actually take a sample. But it was very likely that she was also raped. So it's thought that those sounds could have been from the girls being raped, right? So police, they've identified their suspect, and this kicked off a 10-month-long manhunt. They did finally find Gene. He was in a cabin, actually, in Oklahoma on this Indian reservation. And the media reported his arrest, and when they did, they included a photo of him where he was wearing women's glasses. Because he was wearing women's glasses when he was arrested, which just really, for a lot of people, sealed the deal of thinking that he did it, that he was the killer in this case. The media continued to push that by bringing up the fact that the woman who had testified actually said in her testimony that while he was, raping them, or while he had them kidnapped, he tried on their glasses. So it's kind of a common thing, and a lot of people tied it to the glasses that were found around the campsite. Maybe this guy does have a weird thing for glasses. We don't know. Right? But investigators honestly thought this case was in the bag. The sheriff would tell the jury that he was 1,000% sure that they would convict Gene. But there were some things in this case that, as I was looking into it, and I watched a lot of different things on this, and they just don't quite line up. But the first thing that I have to say right now, or about this case, is that this case, regardless of everything else that happened, this case was about race. Once they identified Gene, and they had this person that was a fall guy, and a lot of the way that police treated and still treat Native American people, it was pretty clear that there was never even another suspect or person of interest investigated. They had identified that Gene could be tied to this, and they went for it. And he knew this. So he actually gave an interview before the trial started where he hinted at the racial undertones that were in this case, and his defense pushed that as well in the trial. The second thing that was just not quite right in this case was evidence. So they had a lot of evidence to tie the cave to the crime scene. That was not a question. Whoever was in that cave was at the crime scene, hands down. They even had physical evidence like hair, fingerprints, and semen that were found at the crime scene. There was actually semen on one of the bodies, not just DNA that was able to be swabbed. So they had a lot of evidence, but it didn't actually identify or uniquely identify Gene. So the hair evidence in today's criminal investigation world is not worth anything. Hair basically is compared by looking at it under a microscope and comparing it to another piece of hair. So the hair evidence, it could be tied to him, but there's also a pretty good chance that it could also be tied to another Indian or another Native American person, right? Someone with hair similar to his. Your hair is not all that unique. So that, it didn't rule him out, but it didn't say he was the only suspect. The next thing was the footprint. The bloody footprint that was found inside of the tent was identified to be a size 9.5. Jean wore a size 11. That's tough. Like, going down a size and a half, that's a big assumption to make. That's a lot. And then the third thing, and possibly the most damning of like the reason that it couldn't have been him, or the point that the defense made, was that there was semen found at the crime scene. And everybody's like, well, yeah. But the defense said in the trial that Jean had a vasectomy, which, if you're not familiar with vasectomies, which I wasn't, but that means that he could not produce semen, which means that this could not have been him. Or he could not have been the sole person that was there, and that was the prosecution's case. So all of this was enough to introduce reasonable doubt. And the jury ruled very quickly, or came back very quickly with a not guilty verdict. Gene Hart had thousands of supporters all over the country who believed in his innocence. And they celebrated with him that he was found not guilty for this. However, do you remember earlier in the story where I mentioned that Gene had escaped from prison? Yeah. So he actually still had about 300 years on his sentence, plus a little bit of extra for the fact that he escaped from prison. So even though he was found not guilty, after the trial, Gene Hart was returned to prison. So in my mind, I'm like, well, he should have been in jail anyway, right? I don't know, and I can't say whether or not he did this, but the investigators were shocked. I mean, of course they're glad that he's going back to prison because they firmly believed that he was their guy. One investigator actually said, well, we can't keep searching for the killer. We already found him, and the jury just didn't agree, which is not how justice works. Just saying. But the police were convinced that it was him, so they never found another suspect, and the case went cold. To this day, this case is unsolved. But 2 months after all of this went down, it was 1979, Gene Hart dies. He was in prison working out and had a heart attack. And so he passed away more than 40 years ago at this point. So because the case is cold, it does still get investigated from time to time. And in 2007, DNA evidence had become a thing. And so they sent the semen and the DNA that was found, the swabs that were able to be taken, off to a lab. But it was found to be too degraded, or they weren't able to test it for some reason. But in 2017, the sheriff in the town did this massive fundraising effort because he really wanted to retest it. DNA has come a long way, or really just like leaps and bounds in that 10 years. And so he raised the money and they sent the DNA off to be tested again. And as of this point, December 4th, 2020, there has not been a result of that DNA evidence published, or of that new DNA testing published. That's not to say it hasn't come back. If they're trying to do genetic genealogy, it's really possible that they're investigating leads from it right now, but nothing has hit the news about this case since then. But turn your Google alerts on, friends. I learned about that recently, and I'm super into it. Anyway, so I'm going to leave you with 2 things about this case that I find really ominous, fishy, just generally creepy, like leave a light on when you go to sleep tonight kind of creepy. I don't know. They give me the chills. So these 2 things that I think you should know about this case. The first is that the camp staff was warned of the murders. So when I say that, before camp, they have a camp counselor training event. And that training event was actually cut short because one of the tents was ransacked. I wasn't able to find which tent it was, but the tent that was ransacked, there was a note that was found in the tent, and it said, "I'll kill 3 girls in tent 1." And it had a drawing of a stick figure that looked like it was being either hung or strangled with a rope. Now, if you don't know the layout of camp, or on the map where it says the numbers, Tent 8 in Kiowa could have easily been looked at as Tent 1. So it kind of goes in a horseshoe, and Tent 8 is the last one. That could be 1, and you could think it goes backwards. So there are a lot of people who believe that the person that ransacked this cabin or tent was the same person that killed Lori, Denise, and Michele that night. The second thing, and once again, this case is unsolved, but when they conducted an autopsy on Gene Hart after he passed in prison, the doctor found something really, really interesting. So that vasectomy that Gene had, it never took, which means that Gene was able to produce sperm, and he knew it. This case is unsolved. They're waiting for the DNA evidence to come back to see if they can determine if it was Gene, if it wasn't Gene. We don't know at this point. But I just, that's so creepy. How could you let your defense attorney go argue that? I have a lot of thoughts. But tell me what you think. Leave it in the comments. I want to know, do you think Gene did it? Do you think it was somebody else? Was he framed? Was this truly just the police found an easy suspect cop-out? Because that happens so often in the criminal justice system. Like, is this another incidence of that? I don't know where I stand. Like, part of me is like, yes, he did it, but part of me is like, who wears a shoe 2.5 sizes too small? That's just weird. And like the glasses thing, they knew he had a glasses thing. That very well could have been kind of shuffled and like put into the news to make it look that way, right? I don't know. But anyway, if you made it this far and you're not already subscribed to me, I think we both know what you should be doing. I feel really weird about the fact that I just winked at you. But go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Give me a thumbs up. Comment and tell me what you thought of this story, what you think really happened. And if there's anybody that you think that I should look into for the next video. I've got a couple Google alerts set on things that have happened recently, actually, that I'm hoping to be able to cover for you soon. But I would love to hear of things that are going on near you or that have happened that you want me to cover. I have a lot of fun researching these things, actually. So send me fun things to look into, or interesting things to look into. I hope you all have a great week, or great weekend, great week, and I will see you again next Friday. Bye.